The helicarrier shield designated Prometheus was running a routine training rotation 40,000 feet above the Atlantic when the sky turned purple. Not the dramatic purple of a sunset bleeding into storm clouds. Not the chemical purple of an alien energy signature shield sensors had cataloged before. This was something older, something that had no entry in any database on Earth, because the universe had never thought to warn this particular planet about what it looked like when a god of destruction decided to wake up somewhere inconvenient. Specialist Yana Reyes was the first person aboard the Prometheus to see it. She was on the outer observation deck, running a maintenance check on the starboard sensor array, when the color bled across the horizon from the east like ink dropped into water. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, the wrench in her hand forgotten, watching a sphere of purple-gold energy roughly the size of a city block descend through the upper atmosphere with the casual unhurriedness of something that had never once considered that the atmosphere might object. It did not slow down. She hit the alarm. The Prometheus went to red alert in under 4 seconds. That was actually a record. It did not matter. The sphere impacted the ocean surface approximately 2 nautical miles off the port bow, and the resulting shockwave hit the helicarrier like a fist. Not a metaphorical fist. A literal pressure wave of displaced atmosphere and superheated steam that crumpled the outer sensor array rays had been maintaining, sheared 2 of the secondary stabilizer fins clean off, and sent 17 crew members to the medical bay, with injuries ranging from mild concussion to a dislocated shoulder suffered by Lieutenant Commander Park, who had the particular misfortune of being halfway through a doorway when the wave hit. Captain Elias Morrow reached the command deck in time to watch the ocean settle. For approximately 4 seconds, nothing happened. The Atlantic churned where the sphere had hit. Steam rose in columns. The Prometheus's surviving sensors swept the impact zone with everything they had and returned readings that made the chief science officer, Dr. Amara Osai, go very quiet in a way that experienced SHIELD personnel recognized as the silence of someone trying to decide whether their instruments were malfunctioning or whether the universe had simply stopped making sense. Osai Morrow said, "The object that entered the atmosphere," Osai said carefully, "had a mass inconsistent with anything we have on record. The energy signature doesn't match Asgardian, doesn't match Kree, Skrull, or any of the 17 extraterrestrial classifications in the current database." A pause. "It also doesn't match any Infinity Stone derivatives." "What does it match?" Another pause, longer this time. "Nothing," she said. "The computer isn't returning a match. It's just returning the word unknown and then what appears to be a question mark, which I didn't know the system could do." Morrow opened his mouth to respond. The ocean exploded. Not violently. That was the strangest part. It was almost polite. The way the water simply parted, pushed aside in a perfect circle 50 meters across as something rose from the surface with the measured dignity of something that found the concept of dramatic emergence vaguely beneath it. The figure that rose from the Atlantic Ocean stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall and was, without question, the least physically imposing thing Morrow had seen emerge from an extraterrestrial impact event in 11 years of SHIELD service. He was thin, ears too large for his head, a face that managed to be simultaneously ancient and oddly cat-like, with eyes the color of gold coins that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back with interest. He wore robes of deep purple and white, layered in a style that suggested ceremony and comfort in equal measure. Around his neck hung a set of ornate earrings, In one hand, he carried a scepter topped with a sphere that matched the color of the sky he'd just fallen through. He floated 6 inches above the ocean surface, looked down at the water with an expression of mild displeasure, and then looked up at the helicarrier. The helicarrier looked back. "Scan," Morrow said quietly. Osai's hands moved. The sensors swept. The readings came back, and this time the silence from the science station lasted nearly 10 full seconds. "Captain," Osai said, and her voice had acquired a quality Morrow had never heard from her before, a quality that took him a moment to identify as something adjacent to awe. "The energy output from that individual is..." She stopped, started again. "Our sensors are giving me a number that is either catastrophically wrong or means that the person floating over the Atlantic Ocean has more raw energy output than every power source on Earth combined, including the sun. That can't be right." "No," she agreed, "it probably can't, a beat. The reading hasn't changed." The figure floating above the ocean tilted his head. His golden eyes swept the helicarrier with the unhurried assessment of someone examining a curiosity in a market stall, deciding whether it was interesting enough to pick up. His expression throughout this process remained one of profound, cosmic boredom shot through with the faintest thread of something that might, under the right circumstances, become mild interest. He raised one hand. The helicarrier's portside weapons array, 12 independent targeting systems representing some of the most advanced non-Stark military hardware in the Western Hemisphere, simply stopped existing. Not explosively, not dramatically. One moment it was there, 200 tons of precision-engineered ordnance and targeting hardware. The next moment there was a faint shimmer of purple light and it was gone, replaced by nothing at all, as though it had never been part of the ship to begin with. Morrow stared at the gap in his ship's hull. "He disintegrated it," Osai said. "Complete matter destruction. No debris field, no energy discharge, no radiation. It's just gone." "Get me Fury," Morrow said. His voice was remarkably steady. He would be proud of that later. "Get me Fury right now." 3,000 miles away, in a situation room beneath the Triskelion, Nick Fury watched the live feed from the Prometheus with his one good eye, and the expression of a man who had personally witnessed the Chitauri invasion, the fall of S.H.I.E.L.D., the return of Hydra, the arrival of Thor, the Infinity War, and the subsequent reversal of the Infinity War, and had therefore developed what he privately considered a finely calibrated sense of exactly how bad any given situation actually was. This situation, he decided, was very bad. "What are we calling it?" Maria Hill asked from his left, her eyes on the same feed. "We're not calling it anything yet," Fury said. "We're watching it." On screen, the figure had drifted slightly closer to the Prometheus. He was now examining the gap where the weapons array had been with the expression of a craftsman reviewing their own work. Not proud, exactly. More like someone checking that a task had been completed to an adequate standard. "He took out a weapons array without blinking," Hill said. "I noticed. The energy readings from Osai's report are. I read them." "Nick," Hill turned to look at him directly, "those numbers aren't possible. A lot of things that have happened in the last decade weren't possible." Fury reached for his comm. "Get me Stark. Get me Rogers. Get me Thor if he's on this side of the Rainbow Bridge." He paused. "And get me Banner. Keep him on standby, not active. Last thing we need is two beings of incomprehensible power having a conversation by destroying New Jersey." "What about the Prometheus?" "Morrow's sitting 40,000 feet above this thing with half a weapons system." "Tell Morrow to do absolutely nothing," Fury said. "Tell him to observe. Tell him to document. Tell him that the moment he fires a single thing at whatever that is, I will personally ensure he spends the rest of his career counting inventory in a supply depot in Greenland." He looked back at the screen. "We don't shoot at things we don't understand. Not anymore." On the feed, the figure had turned away from the Prometheus entirely. He was looking east, toward the distant smudge of the American coastline, with an expression of renewed interest. He began drifting in that direction. "He's moving toward the coast," someone said from the far end of the room. "Yes," Fury said, "I can see that." Beerus was hungry. This was not unusual. Beerus was, in the technical and cosmic sense, almost always hungry. The god of destruction's relationship with food was one of the defining aspects of his existence, which would have surprised most beings in the universe who assumed that a being capable of destroying planets with a casual flick of his wrist would have motivations slightly more elevated than finding something worth eating. Those beings would have been wrong. Wise had made a genuine effort over the millennia to explain to Beerus that his priorities might benefit from some reordering. Beerus had made an equally genuine effort to explain to Wise that the problem with that suggestion was that it was boring. He had arrived in this universe by accident. That much was clear. The dimensional fabric here was different, denser in some ways and thinner in others, like fabric woven by someone who had learned technique but not yet mastered tension. He had been sleeping, which was his default state, and the dream had pulled him sideways through reality in a direction that didn't technically have a name yet, and he had woken up falling through an alien sky above an alien ocean. This was irritating but not catastrophic. He had assessed the situation with the efficiency of someone who had been navigating cosmic disasters for millions of years. The energy signatures here were interesting, he had to admit. There was something woven into the fundamental fabric of this universe that his senses kept catching at the edge of perception. A power he didn't have a name for, distributed unevenly through the population like light through uneven glass. The flying metal structure with the weapon systems had been moderately amusing. He had removed the weapons because they were pointing at him, and pointing weapons at the god of destruction was the kind of thing he generally preferred to discourage before it escalated to something tedious. He had not hurt anyone. This was, for Beerus, a significant act of restraint, and he felt it deserved at least internal acknowledgement. He drifted toward the coastline because coastlines in his experience tended to mean civilization, and civilization tended to mean food. The golden late afternoon light of this planet's sun was pleasant on his face. The air was breathable and had a quality to it that suggested a world that still had some life in it, which he generally preferred. Worlds that had been drained of life tended to have a flatness to their atmospheric taste that he found unappetizing. The coastline resolved into a city. Large, chaotic, dense with the energy signatures he'd been catching at the edge of his senses, some of them quite strong by the local scale. He could feel the architecture of power here, the way it moved through streets and gathered in certain buildings, the hierarchy of it. It was not so different from other civilizations he had visited, in that the most powerful beings tended to cluster together in places they considered important. He descended toward the city. Below him, the city began to notice. This was, he supposed, inevitable. The corner of 5th Avenue and 43rd Street, Manhattan, was not a location that typically featured in major cosmic events. It had hosted a corner store called Varga's Family Groceries for 31 years, operated currently by Marco Vargas, age 58, who had inherited it from his father and had absolutely no intention of doing anything with the rest of his life except running it competently and arguing with his suppliers about produce quality. Marco was restocking the front display when the shadow fell. He looked up. The being floating 8 feet above the sidewalk looked down at him with golden eyes, and then looked at the display of fruit Marco had just been arranging. "What?" the being said, in a voice that carried the weight of someone accustomed to being understood regardless of language barriers. "Is that?" Marco looked at the display. "Mangoes," he said, because they were. The being descended to sidewalk level, reached out, and picked up a mango with the careful deliberation of someone examining something they had never encountered before. He turned it over in long fingers. He smelled it. He took a bite, skin and all, chewed thoughtfully, and his expression underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation from bored assessment to something approaching genuine attention. "This," Beerus said, "is adequate." Marco Vargas, who had survived 31 years of New York retail, a pandemic, 2 attempted robberies, and 1 incident involving a runaway hot dog cart, looked at the ancient cosmic being eating his produce on the sidewalk and made the pragmatic decision that had served him well throughout his career. "You want a bag?" he said. Beerus looked at him. For a long moment, the golden eyes assessed Marco Vargas with the full attention of a being who had destroyed planets for insufficient cause, and Marco Vargas looked back with the equanimity of a man who had once negotiated a produce contract at 3 in the morning in the Bronx wholesale market. Something in Beerus's expression shifted, not softly, not warmly, but something. "Yes," Beerus said, "I want a bag." The Avengers arrived 11 minutes later. All things considered, 11 minutes was remarkable response time. Tony Stark descended in the Mark L, repulsor systems humming, and what he saw when he reached the intersection of 5th and 43rd was not, in his extensive experience with alien arrivals, what he had expected. The alien being was sitting on the front stoop of a corner store eating a mango. Next to him on the step was a paper bag containing what appeared to be 3 more mangoes, a container of something Stark's helmet scanner identified as tres leches cake, and a bunch of bananas. The store owner was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching the being eat with the particular expression of a New Yorker who has decided that this, too, is simply a thing that is happening. Steve Rogers landed beside Stark. Thor descended from the other side, Mjolnir in hand, the crackle of lightning in the air around him. Beerus looked up from the mango. He looked at the 3 of them with the methodical assessment of someone reviewing a moderately interesting menu. His golden eyes settled on Thor and stayed there. "You," Beerus said, "have divine energy. Interesting." He took another bite of mango. "Sit down, you're making the street look crowded." Thor, who was not accustomed to being told to sit down, looked at Stark. Stark's helmet was running every scan it had. The numbers coming back were making his suit's AI run multiple verification protocols. He opened a private comm channel to Hill. "Maria," he said quietly, "my suit is telling me this individual has energy output that makes the Hulk look like a watch battery." "We know," Hill said. "Fury says don't shoot anything." "I was not planning on shooting anything," Stark said. "I want that on record." Beerus had finished the mango. He dropped the pit neatly into the paper bag and selected the tres leches cake with the focus of a connoisseur. He took a bite. His eyes closed. For 3 seconds, the god of destruction sat on the stoop of Vargas family groceries on 5th Avenue with his eyes closed and an expression on his ancient face that was, unmistakably, pleasure. "This planet," Beerus announced, opening his eyes, "has acceptable food." It was Steve Rogers would later reflect. Not the most alarming thing a being of apparent cosmic power had ever said upon arriving on Earth. But it was somehow the most unsettling. If you want to see more cosmic-level beings crashing into the Marvel Universe, hit that subscribe button and drop what character you want to see enter Marvel next in the comments below. With great power comes great responsibility, and apparently, great food criticism. The SHIELD Mobile Command Unit, parked 2 blocks from Varga's family groceries, was, by any reasonable measure, overkill. 3 tactical response teams, a rolling laboratory staffed by 4 of the best xenobiologists currently on SHIELD's payroll, 2 armored vehicles whose purpose was left diplomatically unspecified in the deployment manifest, and Nick Fury himself, sitting in the back of a black SUV with a tablet displaying live sensor feeds, and the expression of a man who had long since made peace with the fact that his job description included mornings like this one. Tony Stark's voice came through the comm with the particular quality it got when he was trying to sound casual about something that was not casual at all. "So here's the situation," Stark said. "He's on his 4th piece of fruit. Marco from the store has brought out a chair for him. They appear to be having a conversation about ripeness indicators in tropical produce." Fury did not respond immediately. "I want to be clear," Stark continued, "that my suit has now run 47 independent verification sweeps on this individual's energy signature, and every single one of them has come back with numbers that should be physically impossible. We are talking about a level of energy output that makes Thor look like a phone charger, and he is sitting on a stoop eating cake." "What's his disposition?" Fury asked. "Calm, bored maybe, not hostile as far as I can tell. Though I want to note for the record that the weapons array on the Prometheus was removed with what my suit is describing as a localized destruction field, which is a term my suit just invented because it didn't have an existing category for what happened." "Rogers." Steve's voice came on quieter. "He's aware of all of us. He knows exactly where each of us is standing and what we're doing. He's just choosing not to make it an issue right now." "How do you know that?" "Because every few minutes his eyes move to each of us in sequence, like he's taking attendance." A pause. "He's not afraid of us, Nick, not even a little." Fury looked at the sensor feed. The figure on the stoop had accepted what appeared to be a glass of something from Marco. He was examining it with interest. "Thor," Fury said, switching channels, "you said you recognized the energy signature." Thor's voice carried the particular weight it got when he was genuinely uncertain, which was, in Fury's experience, rarer and more significant than when he was simply being dramatic. "I said I recognized the category," Thor said carefully. "Divine energy, old divine energy, older than anything I have encountered, including the Infinity Stones. Whatever this being is, Fury, he predates Asgard. He predates most things I know of. The energy around him has the quality of something that was present at or near the creation of this universe." "Is he a threat?" A long pause. "I think," Thor said, "that the more relevant question is whether he chooses to be. And at this moment, he appears to have chosen to drink what I believe is horchata." The meeting, such as it was, happened on the sidewalk because Beerus declined to go anywhere else. He made this clear not through aggression or threat, but through the simple cosmic authority of someone who had never once in his existence gone somewhere he did not feel like going. Fury had suggested the mobile command unit. Stark had offered the tower. Rogers had carefully not suggested anything, having correctly assessed the situation. Beerus had looked at each of them in turn and said, "This location has food. Those locations presumably do not. I will stay here. Marco had, at this point, produced a small table. It was a card table, the folding kind, with slightly uneven legs that Marco addressed by putting a folded piece of cardboard under one corner. He set it up on the sidewalk in front of his store with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been setting up sidewalk displays for 3 decades, and did not particularly care that the audience for this particular setup included 3 of Earth's most powerful heroes, a god of destruction of unknown origin, and a growing crowd of New Yorkers who were filming everything on their phones with the cheerful shamelessness of a population that had long since decided that alien incidents were simply content. Beerus sat at the card table. Fury sat across from him. Stark stood off to the side because sitting felt too committed and standing felt too aggressive, so he compromised on a kind of deliberate casual lean that he was aware looked exactly as calculated as it was. "Let's start simple," Fury said. "What's your name?" "Beerus." "Where are you from?" Beerus considered this with the patience of someone for whom questions about origin required a meaningful quantity of cosmological context. "A universe adjacent to this one. The dimensional structure here is different from my home. The arrival was unintentional." "You didn't mean to come here." "Correct. Can you go back?" The golden eyes assessed Fury with something that was not quite respect and not quite dismissal, but occupied the interesting space between them. "In time. The dimensional resonance needs to stabilize. This is not a concern." "How long?" "Unknown." Beerus picked up a banana from his paper bag and peeled it with the meditative focus he applied to all food-related activities. "Some time. Weeks, perhaps, possibly longer. Time functions slightly differently between universes." He ate the banana in 2 bites. "Your planet has acceptable food. I am not uncomfortable here." Fury absorbed this information. "The weapons system on our aircraft, you destroyed it." "It was pointing at me." "It's standard protocol when we encounter an unknown." "It was pointing at me," Beerus said again, with exactly the same intonation, which somehow conveyed more clearly than elaboration would have that this was the complete and final explanation, and that further context was neither required nor available. Fury, who had negotiated with Norse gods, alien warlords, and 3 different versions of Hydra, recognized the conversational style of someone who was not going to be moved by appeals to institutional process, and adjusted accordingly. "Fair enough," he said. "We'd appreciate it if you refrained from destroying any more equipment." "I will refrain from destroying things that are not pointing at me," Beerus said. "That is the most specific commitment I am prepared to make." It was, Fury decided, probably the most honest answer he'd gotten from an alien entity in 11 years. "I'll take it," he said. The issue of what to do with a god of destruction, who intended to remain on Earth for an indeterminate period while his dimensional transit window restabilized was, Tony Stark reflected, genuinely novel even by the standards of the last decade. He raised this point in the emergency Avengers briefing that happened in the mobile command unit, while Beerus was occupied with what Marco had described, with the quiet pride of a professional, as his mother's recipe for arroz con leche. "We can't contain him," Stark said. "I want to be absolutely clear about that up front so we don't waste anyone's time. The numbers from my suit's analysis are not improving with additional data. He is operating at a power level that makes containment a theoretical exercise rather than a practical one." "What about observation?" Hill asked. Observation is possible. He appears indifferent to being observed. He's also clearly aware of every sensor we have on him, which means observation is less intelligence gathering and more him allowing us to watch. Recruitment, Fury said. Silence around the table. I will personally pay to see whoever volunteers for that conversation, Stark said. I'm serious. Name a number. There's a more immediate problem, Bruce Banner said from the far end of the table. He'd been quiet since the briefing started, which meant he'd been thinking, which in Fury's experience meant something useful was coming. The energy signature he's putting off. We've been treating it as a threat assessment problem, but it's also a beacon problem. Anything in this universe sensitive enough to detect power at that level is going to notice him. The room went quiet in a different way. What are we talking about? Rogers asked. Banner adjusted his glasses. I've been running projections. The energy output he's passively radiating, just existing here without apparently doing anything, is detectable at ranges we'd normally associate with Infinity Stone events. Maybe further. He paused. If Thanos has detection capabilities in that range, he notices. If the Celestials have detection capabilities in that range, they notice. If Galactus... Let's not say the rest of that sentence, Stark said. They notice, Banner finished not unkindly. Fury looked at the table, looked at Banner, looked at the feed showing Beerus accepting a second bowl of a roast con lech from Marco, with the focused deliberation of someone conducting a serious culinary evaluation. How long do we have before something notices? Unknown. Could be soon. Could be weeks, depending on whether anyone's actively scanning in the right frequency range. Banner turned his tablet to show a graph that featured a line going in a direction Fury did not enjoy looking at. What I can tell you is that the longer he stays, the larger the signature gets. He's been here 3 hours and the passive output has increased 11%. I think this universe's energy profile is slightly unfamiliar to him, and his system is compensating, pushing harder to maintain baseline function. Can we tell him? Rogers said. Every face at the table turned to Rogers. He's not unreasonable, Rogers said. He hasn't hurt anyone. He told Fury the truth about his situation. If there's a risk that his presence here draws something dangerous, that's something he should know. You want to walk up to the being who vaporized a weapons array and tell him he's a liability, Stark said. I want to treat him like an intelligent adult capable of making informed decisions, Rogers said, which is what I'd want someone to do for me. The table was quiet. Fine, Fury said. Rogers, you tell him. Steve found Beerus on the stoop again. Marco had gone inside, the evening settling cool and blue over the city, the streetlights coming on in sequence down the avenue. The crowd of onlookers had thinned to a dedicated core of approximately 20 people who had clearly decided that whatever this was, it was worth staying for. Beerus was looking at the city with the patient attention of someone cataloging something new, not with the hunger of conquest, not with the assessment of a predator. More the way, Steve thought, a very experienced traveler looks at a place they have never been before, nodding its qualities with the practiced neutrality of someone who has seen enough of the universe to find novelty itself remarkable. Steve sat down on the stoop next to him. Beerus did not look at him, but the slight tilt of his head acknowledged the presence. You said you're here by accident, Steve said, that you'll need time before you can go home. Correct. While you're here, you're putting off an energy signature that's detectable across significant cosmic distances. One of our people ran projections. There are entities in this universe that might respond to a signal like that. Some of them are, Steve paused, choosing the word carefully, complicated. Now Beerus looked at him. The golden eyes were direct and entirely without the performance that Steve associated with powerful beings acknowledging threats to their ego. He simply looked, assessed, and processed. "You're warning me," Beerus said. "Yes. Not asking me to leave, not threatening consequences, warning me about a risk I may not have known existed." "Yes." Beerus was quiet for a moment. The city moved around them, cabs and foot traffic and the distant percussion of a city that never fully stopped. And the god of destruction sat with it and thought about what Steve Rogers had just done with the unhurried consideration he brought to things that surprised him. "Your friend," Beerus said finally, "the one in the red and gold armor. He would have told me with more words and more calculations and likely some kind of visual display." "Probably," Steve agreed. "The large blonde one with the hammer would have framed it as a request between honorable warriors." "Also probably. You just told me. You seemed like someone who'd prefer that." Beerus made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite approval, but occupied a register somewhere between them. He looked back at the city. "The entities you are concerned about, how many are capable of presenting a genuine challenge?" Steve thought about how to answer that honestly. "A few." "How many of them have actually challenged you?" "Most of them eventually." Beerus nodded slowly, with the satisfaction of a connoisseur identifying a quality he had been hoping to find. "This is an interesting planet," he said. It was the closest thing to a compliment Steve had heard from him, and somehow, in its understatement, it carried weight. The recruitment attempts, as Stark had predicted, were varied and uniformly unsuccessful, though each in its own distinctive way. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s approach was bureaucratic. Fury had prepared a formal offer, sanctuary and logistical support during Beerus's stay in exchange for cooperation with assessment protocols and a mutual non-aggression agreement. Beerus had listened to the entire proposal with the patience of someone who had sat through longer presentations, then asked whether the agreement included guaranteed access to Earth food for the duration of his stay. Fury, recognizing the negotiation, had said yes. Beerus had signed the document, which Marco witnessed, and which Fury had laminated and filed in a folder labeled Deity Agreements, which was already thicker than most people expected. The scientific community's approach arrived in the form of Dr. Helen Cho and 3 colleagues from a consortium that included 2 former S.H.I.E.L.D. scientists and 1 MIT researcher who had specifically requested the assignment and had been vibrating with barely contained professional excitement for approximately 6 hours. They had equipment. They had protocols. They had 17 pages of non-invasive assessment procedures that had been approved by 4 separate ethics committees. Beerus had allowed exactly 4 minutes of scanning before informing them, with the precision of someone who knew exactly how long patience lasted, that if they wished to continue, they would need to provide food. Helen Cho had produced a granola bar from her coat pocket with the look of a scientist who had prepared for contingencies. Beerus had examined it, eaten half, declared it insufficient but genuine, and allowed another 12 minutes of scanning before announcing he was done. The data they got back had kept the consortium busy for 72 straight hours and produced preliminary findings that included the phrase, "We may need to reconsider the upper theoretical limits of biological energy containment." And in Dr. Cho's personal notes, simply, "impossible, but measurable." The approach that arrived without announcement, and without shield authorization came at 3 in the morning on Beerus's second day on Earth. Beerus had been sleeping on the roof of Varga's family groceries, which he had selected because it was elevated and quiet, and because Marco had not objected when Beerus had simply drifted upward at 9 p.m. and settled there. The night sky was clearer than it usually got in Manhattan, and Beerus had been examining it with the relaxed attention of someone noting familiar constellations in unfamiliar configurations. The 4 figures that landed on the roof behind him moved with professional silence. Black uniforms, advanced tech, the kind of coordinated approach that suggested significant resources and the specific operational philosophy of people who believed that sufficient preparation could neutralize any target. Beerus did not move. "We're not here to hurt you," the lead figure said, calm voice. "Practice diplomacy over a hard edge. We represent interests that would like to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. We have technology that could accelerate your return home. We have resources that could make your stay here considerably more comfortable." Beerus opened one eye. "And if I'm not interested in your arrangement," he said, with the somnolent calm of someone too deeply relaxed to bother with complete attention, "what happens then?" A pause. "We'd prefer not to go there." "I know," Beerus said. He closed his eye again. "You should leave. You came here with devices designed to incapacitate. I noticed them when you landed. They are not going to function as intended." A beat. "I am also quite comfortable already. Marco made excellent food for dinner. I do not need your resources." Another pause, longer this time, the silence of people recalibrating. "We have the ability to." The devices simply stopped existing. The same way the Prometheus's weapons array had. A shimmer of purple-gold light, lasting less than a second. And then the technology was gone, and 4 operatives were standing on a rooftop with empty hands, and the particular stillness of people who have just had a very important point demonstrated to them. "Tell whoever sent you," Beerus said, still without moving, still with his eye closed, "that I am not a weapon to be acquired. I am not a resource to be accessed. I am a god of destruction on a temporary visit, and I am enjoying the food here, and anyone who disturbs my sleep again will find that my patience is not unlimited." He paused. "Also, the mango vendor on 7th is inferior. Do not buy from there." The 4 operatives left. Beerus returned to his examination of the unfamiliar stars. On the street below, Marco, who had been watching from the doorway with a cup of coffee, nodded once with the satisfaction of a man whose rooftop guest had handled the situation exactly right, and went back inside. The thing about Marco Vargas, Steve Rogers reflected over the following days, was that he had simply decided Beerus was a person who needed feeding and had proceeded accordingly. There was no calculation in it. No assessment of risk versus benefit, no contingency planning, no political consideration of what relationship with a god of destruction might mean for his standing in any community. Marco had a store. The store had food. Beerus had arrived and been hungry. The logic was, to Marco, complete. It was this quality, Steve thought, watching the two of them argue with considerable mutual investment about the relative merits of fresh versus canned coconut milk from the corner of the store where he was pretending to read a newspaper, that had earned something from Beerus that nothing else on Earth had managed in 4 days of his stay. Not S.H.I.E.L.D.'s authority, not Stark's technology, not Thor's divine credentials, not Steve's own careful honesty. Beerus's attention, not the patient, cataloging attention he gave the world in general, the specific attention, the kind that meant something had been filed internally under worth returning to. The fresh is better, Marco was saying, with the certainty of someone who considered this self-evident. There is no argument. The canned has a metallic undertone. The fresh has inconsistency, Beerus said. The canned has predictability. Predictability in a base ingredient is not a flaw. It is if you care about flavor. I care enormously about flavor. That is precisely why predictability in the base allows for controlled variation in the preparation. Marco pointed at him. You sound like you're engineering a weapon, not cooking. I have engineered weapons, Beerus said. Cooking is more demanding. Marco stared at him. Then slowly he laughed. Not politely. Really laughed, the full-bodied laugh of genuine amusement, and Beerus looked at him with the expression of someone surprised to find that they had said something funny, and more surprised to find that they did not mind. Steve lowered the newspaper. He had been present for the Chitauri invasion, for Ultron, for the Infinity War. He had seen the worst that the universe could deliver to this planet, and he had seen the best that the people of this planet could offer in return. But there was something about watching an ancient god of destruction argue about coconut milk with a corner store owner in Manhattan, and finding in that argument something genuine on both sides, that sat with Steve Rogers in a way he didn't entirely have words for. This universe had a way of finding things worth protecting, even in the most unlikely places, even when what showed up was enormous and golden-eyed, and capable of erasing the physics of existence with a gesture. Especially then, maybe. He folded the newspaper. He had a briefing in an hour. Banner had new data on the energy signature propagation, and the projections were moving in directions that were going to require serious conversation. But for now, he stood in the doorway of Varga's family groceries and let the city move around him, and listened to a man who sold mangoes for a living give a god of destruction genuine grief about canned coconut milk, and thought that whatever was coming next, they had at least started from an honest place, which, in his experience, was the only place worth starting from. The energy signature propagation report that Banner presented on day 6 of Beerus's stay on Earth was 43 pages long, included 17 graphs, and contained a section titled Worst Case Scenario Modeling that Banner had briefly considered removing before deciding that honesty, however uncomfortable, was more useful than comfort. He walked the assembled Avengers through it with the measured patience of someone who had learned, over years of working with brilliant people under pressure, that information delivered calmly was processed better than information delivered with appropriate alarm, even when the information itself warranted significant alarm. The summary was this: Beerus's passive energy output had increased 23% since arrival. The increase was not aggressive or intentional. It was, as Banner had suspected, compensatory. A being whose power operated on fundamentally different cosmic architecture than this universe's framework was, at the cellular and subatomic level, working harder than normal simply to exist here. Like a deep-sea creature brought to the surface, his system was pushing against unfamiliar pressure gradients in ways he likely wasn't consciously aware of. The result was a signal. How loud? Fury asked. Banner clicked to the graph that answered that question. Several people in the room made sounds that were not quite words. At current propagation rates, Banner said, the signature is detectable at ranges consistent with the Silver Surfer's cosmic awareness threshold, possibly beyond. He paused. Where the Silver Surfer's awareness reaches, his employer's attention typically follows. The room was quiet with the specific quality of people doing calculations. they did not enjoy. Galactus, Stark said. He's not necessarily coming, Banner said carefully. Detection isn't the same as interest. Galactus has a great deal of cosmic noise to sort through, but the signature is anomalous enough that it's distinguishable from background, and it's getting stronger. He looked at Fury. We have, at best estimate, 2 to 3 weeks before the probability of external response crosses from possible to likely. Does Beerus know? Rogers said. I told him this morning. Every face in the room turned to Banner with the collective expression of people who had not been informed of this conversation and had opinions about that. He asked me to, Banner said. Yesterday, after Steve mentioned the beacon problem, he sought me out specifically, said he preferred the scientist's numbers to the soldier's caution. Banner allowed himself a small, complicated expression. He also asked whether I was the one who got angry and large. I told him yes. He said, quote, that is a respectable adaptation for this universe's power scale. Stark's mouth twitched. What was his response to the numbers? Fury asked. He was interested, Banner said. Not concerned, interested. He asked about the nature of Galactus, specifically his power source and methodology. I gave him an overview. A pause. He described Galactus as, and I want to be precise here, a being with an impressive appetite and poor table manners. The room processed this. He's not afraid of Galactus, Rogers said. No, Banner agreed. Though I want to note that his exact words were beings who consume worlds are not uncommon at the higher scales of existence. The question is always whether they have philosophy behind the hunger or merely hunger. And then he ate the rest of my lunch, which I had not offered, and left. The political maneuvering that Fury had been managing behind the scenes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a career keeping incompatible power structures from colliding became significantly more complicated on day 7 when the Asgardians arrived. Not Thor. Thor was already present, had been present since day 1, and had established what Fury carefully categorized in his reports as a working relationship with Beerus, which in practice meant that the two of them had spent an afternoon in Central Park, engaged in what witnesses described as a philosophical debate about the nature of destruction that had twice almost become a physical altercation, and had ultimately concluded with what appeared to be mutual respect and the consumption of several hot dogs from a nearby stand. The Asgardians who arrived on day 7 were official. An envoy, dispatched through the Bifrost with the full ceremony of the Allfather's court, bearing formal greetings and the kind of diplomatic language that had been crafted over millennia to be simultaneously respectful and carefully noncommittal. Beerus had listened to the envoy's prepared statement from the card table outside Varga's family groceries, which had become, with the quiet inevitability of things that simply work, his default location. He had listened with the patience of someone who had sat through more formal diplomatic addresses than this universe had years of recorded history. When the envoy finished, Beerus had nodded once and said, "Tell the All-Father that I appreciate the courtesy and that if Asgard has interesting food, I would consider a visit." The envoy had not been prepared for this response. The message that went back to Asgard was carefully worded. The message that came back from Asgard was more carefully worded still. Fury read both and recognized, with the resigned expertise of a man who had navigated the Asgardian diplomatic ecosystem before, that Odin was doing exactly what Odin always did when he encountered something he didn't understand. Gathering information while appearing to offer friendship, preparing contingencies while speaking of alliance, and generally treating the situation with the profound caution of someone who had lived long enough to have been surprised before and had very much not enjoyed it. Stark's response was less diplomatic and more direct, which was, Fury had long ago accepted, simply how Stark operated and was on balance more useful than it was problematic. "I want to put sensors on him," Stark said in the briefing on day 8. "Passive sensors, non-invasive, just to get better data on the energy output fluctuations. If we can map the pattern, Banner can refine his timeline projections." "Did you ask him?" Rogers said. "I was going to." "Ask him," Rogers said. "Don't just do it." "I know how to handle." "Tony," Rogers looked at him steadily, "ask him." Stark asked him. Beerus, who had been in the middle of what had become a daily assessment of Marco's inventory with the focused attention of someone taking their culinary research seriously, had listened to Stark's proposal, asked 3 technical questions that were specific enough to make Stark's eyebrows rise, and then said, "If the data helps you predict when something interesting arrives, I have no objection. I prefer to know when battles are coming." He returned to the inventory. "Make the sensors small. I dislike unnecessary attachments." Stark made them the size of a grain of rice and placed 2 of them, with Beerus watching with the calm attention of a being who could remove them at any moment, and was simply choosing not to, on the collar of his robe. "You know," Stark said, straightening up, "for someone who apparently has the power to rearrange the cosmos, you're very reasonable about process." Beerus looked at him. "Power without judgment is just destruction without purpose," he said. "I am a god of destruction. Destruction is my function, but function without philosophy is nothing more than entropy." Stark was quiet for a moment. "I might put that on something." "You may not," Beerus said. "That is mine." The complication arrived, as complications in Fury's experience tended to do, from a direction he had been watching carefully, while the real problem assembled itself from a direction he had not. He had been tracking aim. Advanced idea mechanics had reconstituted itself, again, with the particular institutional resilience of an organization whose membership was defined by intelligence and motivated by the specific kind of wounded ego that comes from being smart enough to understand exactly how far the world has failed to recognize it. Their interest in Beerus had been evident from the sensor intercepts Shield had been quietly collecting since day 2, and Fury had been managing it with the unhurried competence of someone who had neutralized AIM operations before and was confident in his capacity to do so again. What he had not adequately accounted for was Dr. Doom. Victor Von Doom did not announce himself. He did not send envoys. He did not make diplomatic overtures or file formal objections or appear in any of the intelligence channels that Fury monitored with the comprehensive paranoia of a man who believed that sufficient surveillance was the foundation of adequate preparation. Doom simply appeared on the morning of day 9, standing in the street outside Varga's family groceries with his arms crossed and his green cloak moving in a wind that didn't seem to be affecting anything else on the block, and looked at Beerus with the focused attention of the most dangerous intellect Fury had ever spent a career being cautious about. Beerus looked back. Marco, who had come outside to restock the display, looked at Doom, looked at Beerus, and went back inside to get coffee. "You are the anomaly," Doom said, "not a question." "I am Beerus," Beerus said. "God of destruction, I don't know what you mean by anomaly." "The energy signature that has been propagating through this universe's cosmic framework for 9 days, Doom said. "I detected it on day 3. I have spent 6 days analyzing it." He paused, and in the pause was the weight of someone delivering information they consider significant. Your presence here is not simply a navigation accident. The dimensional fabric in this universe shows signs of deliberate thinning at the breach point. Someone or something created the conditions for your arrival. The street was very quiet. Beerus's golden eyes were still, not the stillness of someone processing new information, the stillness of someone encountering information that connects to things they had already been considering and does not like what the connection implies. "Show me," Beerus said. The data Doom presented, in a session that took place at the card table, and that Stark attended with barely concealed professional resentment at not having found this first, was thorough and precise and deeply unwelcome. The dimensional breach that had deposited Beerus in this universe showed, on close analysis, the markers of external manipulation. Not crudely, not recently. The thinning had been introduced gradually, over a period that Doom estimated at several months, in increments small enough to avoid detection by any standard monitoring system. "Someone prepared this," Doom said. "They created a funnel. They needed a specific type of energy profile, a being of sufficient power and sufficient destructive alignment to pass through without the breach collapsing, and they needed that being to arrive here." He looked at Beerus directly. "The question I cannot answer from the data alone is why." "You're saying someone kidnapped him," Stark said. "I'm saying someone arranged his arrival," Doom said, with the precise diction of someone distinguishing between a careless summary and an accurate one. Whether that constitutes kidnapping depends on their intent. The intent is not yet evident. Beerus had been very still throughout this presentation, not the relaxed stillness of someone at rest, the focused stillness of something that had shifted into a different mode of operation entirely, the way a cat in full repose becomes, in the space between one breath and the next, something entirely different. "In my universe," Beerus said quietly, "there are beings who would benefit from a god of destruction being displaced, beings who would want me absent from my own universe while something occurred there that I would have prevented." He looked at Doom with eyes that had gone from gold to something darker at their edges. "Or beings who would want me present in a different universe for reasons of their own." "Do you have enemies?" Rogers asked. Beerus looked at him with an expression that was, in its own way, almost fond in its exasperation. "I am a god of destruction," he said. "I have destroyed things that had friends. Yes, I have enemies." "How bad?" Fury said. Beerus considered the question with genuine seriousness, which was, Fury had learned over 9 days, the most reliable indicator that what followed would be worth paying attention to. "The beings in my universe capable of orchestrating something like this," he said, "are a specific category. They are not physical threats in the conventional sense. They are manipulators. They arrange circumstances." He looked at Doom, and something passed between the armored Sorcerer King and the god of destruction that was the recognition of one strategist by another. They would not have sent me here without a purpose, and they would not have chosen this universe randomly. "What's special about this universe?" Banner asked. Beerus was quiet for a moment. "The energy signatures I have been sensing since I arrived," he said. "The distributed power in your population, the cosmic entities active in this universe, the density of conflict of significant events." He paused. "This universe is very loud. At the cosmic scale, it produces more significant events per unit of time than most universes I am aware of. Someone who wanted to observe significant events or trigger them would find this universe attractive." "You're saying someone brought you here as a catalyst," Stark said. Something about your presence here is supposed to cause something to happen. Beerus did not answer immediately. The beacon, Banner said slowly. The energy signature we've been worried about. What if it's not a side effect? What if it's the point? Your presence here, broadcasting at that frequency, specifically draws attention from. Galactus, Stark said, and his voice had changed. The table was silent. Someone brought me here, Beerus said, with the quiet precision of someone laying out the architecture of a betrayal, to the loudest universe they could find, knowing that my energy signature would propagate, knowing what that signature would attract, and knowing that what was attracted would find a planet worth consuming. He looked at Rogers. Your planet specifically, because this planet is the loudest point in this universe. The highest concentration of significant events, of powerful individuals, of cosmic attention. His eyes moved to fury. Someone wants this planet consumed, and they wanted a god of destruction present when it happened, either to trigger the event or to be destroyed by it. Fury looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at Beerus. I don't know who in your universe wants you dead or displaced, Fury said, and I don't know what their full plan is, but I know what this planet has to say about being used as a prop in someone else's scheme. He met the golden eyes directly. We'd like your help, if you're willing. Beerus looked at him. Then slowly, he looked at Marco, who had come back outside with 2 cups of coffee and was holding one out to Beerus with the matter-of-fact generosity that had, over 9 days, assembled itself into something that Beerus did not have a ready word for but recognized, in the deep archive of his ancient experience, as the thing that made destruction always ultimately incomplete. Things worth destroying had no one who brought them coffee. Things worth preserving always did. He took the coffee. He looked at Fury. Tell me what you need, Beerus said. The war room that Fury assembled on day 10 occupied the entire upper floor of a SHIELD safe house in Brooklyn that had been used for, in sequence, a Hydra debrief, a secret Accords negotiation, and one occasion that remained classified at a level that meant even Fury's file on it was itself classified. It was a room that had seen serious things discussed seriously, and it rose to the occasion again with the reliable indifference of good infrastructure. The table seated 14. Every seat was filled. Thor sat to Fury's left, Mjolnir resting on the floor beside his chair, with the casual placement of someone who had carried the same weapon for centuries and no longer thought about where he put it down. Stark was across from Rogers, which Fury had arranged deliberately because the productive tension between them was more useful than comfortable seating. Banner was beside Stark with 3 tablets and the focused quiet of someone who had been running calculations since 4 in the morning. Doom had been invited with the specific reluctance of a man who understood that the most useful person in a room was not always the most welcome one, and had accepted with the specific graciousness of a man who knew exactly why he'd been invited and considered the acknowledgement appropriate. Beerus sat at the far end of the table and ate a bowl of congee that Marco had sent with him in a thermal container, because Marco had decided, with the pragmatic generosity that defined his entire approach to the situation, that strategy sessions required breakfast. Current status, Fury said, Banner. Banner's first tablet came up on the central display. The signature propagation has accelerated. Whatever's happening with the dimensional compensation in Beerus's system, it spiked overnight. We're now at 31% above baseline, and the rate of increase is not linear anymore. He swiped to the second graph. I revised my timeline projections at 3 a.m. The window for probable external response has moved from 2 to 3 weeks to 7 to 10 days. Outer edge. The room absorbed this. Silver Surfer, Rogers asked. Possibly already in range. I can't confirm detection, only propagation distance. Galactus himself. Unknown, the Surfer scouts. If the Surfer detects and reports, the timeline compresses further. Stark was already working on his tablet. I've been modeling an energy-dampening framework, something that could reduce the passive output, essentially a broadcast suppressor. The problem is the scale. He put his own display up beside Banner's. To dampen a signature this large requires a containment architecture I can currently build approximately 4% of. So, working on that. Doom, Fury said. Doom unfolded his arms, which was his version of leaning forward. The dimensional breach analysis is complete. The manipulation was performed by something operating outside conventional cosmic architecture, not a being from this universe. The methodology has no fingerprints I recognize from any known entity in this or adjacent dimensional spaces. He paused. However, the mathematical signature of the thinning technique has a characteristic I find interesting. It is very old. Not old in the way Asgardian magic is old. Old in the way that things were old before most current cosmic structures existed. Every eye in the room moved to Beerus. Beerus had set down his kanji. His golden eyes were on Doom with the complete attention he reserved for information that was rearranging something in his understanding. You recognize it, Rogers said quietly. The age, Beerus said, not the specific signature, but the age is consistent with beings from my universe's earliest periods, before the current divine hierarchy was established. There are entities that predate the structure I am part of. He was quiet for a moment. I had not considered them as candidates. They are not typically interested in action. They observe. They have always observed. Something that's been watching decided to stop watching, Stark said. Or, Doom said, something convinced them to act, which raises the question of what that something is and what it offered. The room was quiet with the weight of a problem that had just grown a dimension larger. Right, Fury said. So we have an unknown ancient entity that manipulated Beerus's arrival, a propagating energy signature that is accelerating toward what amounts to ringing a dinner bell for the most dangerous entity in this universe, a timeline of 7 to 10 days, and an incomplete dampening solution. He looked around the table. Anyone have good news? Marco's kanji, Beerus thought, was excellent. That was the only good news available. The alliance that formed over the following 48 hours was, by any reasonable historical measure, extraordinary. Not because powerful groups chose to cooperate, which happened with reasonable frequency when existential stakes were on the table, but because of who sat across from whom and chose, against every institutional instinct, to set instinct aside. Doom and Stark worked in the same room for 26 consecutive hours. This had happened exactly once before in recorded history, and that occasion had ended with a structural fire. This time, driven by the mutual recognition that the problem in front of them required both the most advanced technological mind on Earth and the most sophisticated sorcerous scientific hybrid intellect available, they worked with the focused mutual antagonism of two people who respected each other's capability, while finding each other's entire existence mildly offensive. The dampening framework they produced at the end of those 26 hours was, Banner assessed when he reviewed it, technically impossible by the theoretical limits of either of their fields individually, and functional by approximately 63% of what they needed. Better than 4, Stark said, looking at the projection with the expression of a man who was proud of the result and deeply annoyed at the ceiling it had hit. The remaining 37% requires an energy source we do not have, Doom said, with the flat honesty of someone who found admitting limitations professionally distasteful but intellectually mandatory. We have a source, Banner said, from the doorway where he had arrived with coffee for 3 and the specific expression of someone who has had an idea they are not entirely comfortable with. We have a source who has been sitting at a card table outside a corner store in Manhattan for 11 days and who has more raw energy output than everything else in this building combined. The silence that followed had a particular texture. You want to ask him to power the dampener, Stark said. I want to present the option and let him decide, Banner said. Which is, as Steve keeps reminding us, what you do with intelligent adults. Stark looked at Doom. Doom looked at Stark. The look exchanged between them was complex and layered and ultimately resolved into the same place, which was the recognition that Banner was correct, and that being correct was, in this instance, also the only available path. Fine, Stark said, but I'm explaining the technical components. He'll ask better questions than you expect, Banner said. He did. When Stark walked Beerus through the dampening framework with the holographic display and the characteristic Stark combination of genuine brilliance and performance of genuine brilliance, Beerus asked 4 questions that made Stark stop mid-sentence twice and revise his explanation. He understood the principle within 10 minutes, asked for clarification on 2 specific mathematical relationships, and then sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with things that required consideration. You want me to reduce my own signal, Beerus said, using this framework as a structured channel for the reduction, so the energy is not simply suppressed but redirected. Redirected into the dampening field itself, yes, self-sustaining once initialized. And this buys time. Potentially doubles the timeline, 14 to 20 days instead of 7 to 10. Beerus looked at the display. If I reduce my output actively, I am diverting attention from passive emission to intentional channeling. I will be less immediately reactive during the initialization period. He looked at Stark with the directness of someone explaining a tactical limitation rather than admitting a vulnerability. Approximately 4 minutes, during which I would be operating at reduced capacity. We'd keep that window covered, Rogers said from the corner, where he had been listening with the focused patience he brought to tactical discussions. Beerus looked at him. You cannot cover me at cosmic scale. No, Rogers agreed, but we can keep anything from reaching you at local scale during 4 minutes, that I can promise. The golden eyes held Rogers for a moment with an assessment that was, Steve thought, one of the more thorough evaluations he had received in his life, and he had been evaluated by people who had access to his complete biological profile. Your confidence, Beerus said finally, is not arrogance, it is assessment. I try, Steve said. Yes, Beerus said, you do. He turned back to Stark. I will power the dampener. Walk me through the initialization sequence. The Silver Surfer arrived on day 12. He came without announcement, descending through the upper atmosphere on his board with the serene inevitability of a cosmic force that had no particular relationship with the concept of convenient timing. Stark's sensors caught him at the edge of the atmosphere, and S.H.I.E.L.D. had 4 minutes of warning, which was enough for Rogers to get everyone to their designated positions, and not enough for anyone to feel comfortable about what was coming. Beerus was at the card table when the surfer landed in the street outside Varga's family groceries, because of course he was. The board settled to the pavement. The silver figure stepped off with the fluid grace of someone who had been moving through the cosmos for longer than most civilizations had existed. He looked at Beerus. Beerus looked back and ate a piece of mango. "You are the source of the signal," the surfer said. His voice carried the particular quality of someone who communicated across cosmic distances as a professional function, and had never entirely lost the resonance of it even in close conversation. "I am Beerus," Beerus said, "god of destruction." The surfer was silent for a moment. The power cosmic moved around him in the restrained way of someone who was not making a display, but couldn't entirely prevent the ambient reality of what they were. "I have reported to my master," the surfer said. "He is aware of your signal. He is aware of this world." "I know," Beerus said. "That is why I intend to reduce the signal." He tilted his head slightly. "You have the power cosmic, I can feel it. It is a legitimate power source. Different architecture from mine, different philosophy," he considered. "Does your master have a philosophy?" The surfer's expression shifted with the complexity of someone for whom that question had a long answer and a personal one. "He has a nature," the surfer said. "The nature requires feeding." "Hunger without philosophy," Beerus said. "I have met beings like that. They are not the most interesting type." He looked at the surfer directly. "I am not asking you to betray your master. I am asking you a question. Is there anything in this universe that your master would find more interesting than this planet?" The surfer was still, not the stillness of someone with no answer, the stillness of someone standing at the edge of a very significant choice about how honestly to answer. "Possibly," the surfer said carefully. "A power source of sufficient magnitude and unfamiliarity might redirect his attention during the approach phase, particularly if the source suggested a world of greater energy yield." "And if I were to produce such a signature," Beerus said, "in a direction away from this world and this universe, through the dimensional breach that brought me here, toward the space between universes where nothing worth consuming exists, would that be sufficient misdirection?" The surfer looked at him for a long moment. "You would be broadcasting into the dimensional void," the surfer said, "baiting an entity of your master's power toward a space with no sustenance. He would discover the deception eventually." "Yes," Beerus said, "but eventually is not now, and now is what I need." He paused. "I am not trying to destroy your master. I am trying to protect this world long enough to close the breach that made this situation possible, after which my signal reduces, the beacon disappears, and your master moves on to whatever else occupies his attention." He looked at the surfer steadily. "This planet is not worth the permanent attention of Galactus, but it is worth the temporary effort of misdirection. The people here are interesting. The food is good. I have found more worth preserving here in 12 days than in visits to systems I knew for centuries." The surfer was quiet for a long time. "I cannot actively assist you," he said finally. "My obligation to my master is real." "I know. But I can be slow," the surfer said, "in my return journey, and I can encounter navigational interference that delays my report by perhaps 6 hours." Beerus nodded once. The surfer looked at him with an expression that carried centuries of its own complicated weight. "The god of destruction," he said quietly, "who negotiates to preserve. There is an irony there worth contemplating." "Destruction and preservation are not opposites," Beerus said. "They are partners. One without the other is just entropy." He picked up another piece of mango. "Enjoy your slow journey." the surfer returned to his board. He rose into the sky with the unhurried grace of someone taking the long route deliberately. The power cosmic left a fatting trail of silver light against the afternoon blue. Marco came out of the store, looked up at the departing figure, and then looked at Beerus. "That was the Silver Surfer," Marco said. "Yes." "Galactus's herald." "Yes." Marco sat down in the chair across the table, the one he had taken to using for these conversations, and rested his arms on the worn surface of the card table with the posture of a man settling in for something serious. So Galactus might be coming. "He is coming," Beerus said. "The question is how much time we have and what we do with it." Marco was quiet for a moment, not afraid exactly, serious in the way of someone who understood the scope of what was being said and was deciding how to hold it. "You bought us time," Marco said. "The surfer bought you time," Beerus corrected. "I simply gave him a reason to." Marco looked at him. "Why, you could leave. The breach is still open enough for you to go back. Banner said so yesterday." Beerus was quiet. "You don't have to stay," Marco said. "This isn't your universe. These aren't your people." The golden eyes moved to the street, the afternoon traffic, the specific quality of light in a city that had been built by people who intended to stay. The smell of the city, layered and alive, the way a place smells when generations have added themselves to it. The sound of it, the magnificent, irritating, endless sound of people living close together and refusing to be quiet about it. "In my universe," Beerus said slowly, "I have destroyed planets. I have ended civilizations. I have reduced things that took millions of years to build to nothing in an afternoon, because destruction is balance and balance is necessary, and I am the instrument of that necessity." He paused. "I have rarely in the long course of my existence found a place that I thought was worth the trouble of protecting." Marco waited. "This street," Beerus said, "has adequate food." It was not, Marco Vargas thought, the most elegant declaration of commitment he had ever heard. It was somehow exactly right. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small container of flan, which he had made that morning, because something had told him that today was going to be a long day and long days needed flan. He set it on the table between them. Beerus looked at it, looked at Marco, lifted a spoon. 3 blocks away, in the SHIELD mobile unit where every word of the conversation had been captured by the passive audio sensors that Beerus was fully aware of and had chosen to ignore, Steve Rogers stood with his arms crossed and looked at the feed with the expression of someone who had just watched something confirm what they had suspected for 12 days. Fury stood beside him. "He's staying," Rogers said. "He was always going to stay," Fury said. "The question was whether he'd decided it yet." Rogers looked at him. 12 days, Fury said. 12 days and he hasn't hurt a single person. He's been poked, prodded, tested, threatened by AIM, and told he's accidentally ringing a dinner bell for the entity that ate 4 planets last century. And he's been eating mangoes on a stoop and arguing about coconut milk. He paused. "That's not someone passing through. That's someone finding something." On the screen, Beerus was eating flan with the focused appreciation he brought to everything Marco fed him. Marco was talking, his hands moving the way they always did when he was making a point about something. Beerus was listening. "We have 6 hours from the surfer's delay plus whatever the dampener buys us," Rogers said, pulling his attention back to the operational present with the discipline of someone who had learned the hard way that emotional observations, however accurate, needed to wait for the right moment. We need to close that breach. Doom says he needs 2 more days on the breach closure calculations, Fury said. Banner thinks he can compress that to 36 hours if Stark stops arguing with Doom's methodology and starts integrating it. I'll talk to Tony. You always say that like it's simple. It's not simple, Rogers said. It just needs doing. He picked up his jacket from the chair behind him, set up the dampener initialization for tonight. If Beerus is ready, we start reducing the signal before the surfer's delay window closes. He headed for the door. And someone call Marco. Tell him we might need his table for a strategy session tonight. Fury watched him go. Looked back at the screen. Beerus had finished the flan and was now looking at the container with the specific expression of someone, deciding whether it was acceptable to indicate they would like more. He decided it was acceptable. He held the container out toward Marco. Marco, without looking up from whatever point he was making, produced another flan from his jacket pocket and set it on the table without breaking conversational stride. Fury looked at this for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 12 days of managing what was objectively one of the most complicated situations of his career, Nick Fury smiled. It was small, it was brief, no one saw it. But it was real. The dampener initialization happened at midnight. Stark had chosen the time deliberately. Midnight in Manhattan meant minimum civilian exposure, maximum darkness to conceal the energy signature of the initialization sequence from anything scanning at optical frequencies, and the specific quality of city quiet that was not silence, but was as close to it as New York ever got. The card table had been moved inside Varga's family groceries at Marco's suggestion, because Marco had decided that if something was going to happen tonight, he wanted it to happen somewhere he could offer people coffee, and no one had found a compelling argument against this. The store was small. 14 people made it crowded. Beerus sat in the center of the space on a chair that Marco had reinforced with a second chair underneath it after the first one had developed an alarming creak, which Beerus had ignored and which Marco had not. Stark stood to his left with a gauntlet-mounted interface running the dampener's initialization sequence. Banner was on the right with 3 tablets. Doom stood near the door with the particular stillness of someone who had contributed everything they could contribute and was now in the position of watching whether it worked. Rogers was by the window. Thor was outside, which he had requested and been granted, because Thor's instinct in situations with undefined threat profiles was to be between the threat and the people he was protecting, and no one had found a compelling argument against that either. Fury was in the mobile unit 2 blocks away because someone needed to manage the tactical picture, and Fury had made peace, over a long career, with the fact that managing the tactical picture was more valuable than being in the room where the moment happened, even when every instinct said otherwise. "Initialization ready," Stark said. "On your signal." Beerus looked at the room, the people in it, the store around them, its shelves stocked with the cheerful density of a place that had been feeding a neighborhood for 30 years, the smell of it layered and specific, coffee and cardboard, and something Marco had been cooking in the back that Beerus had identified as ropa vieja and had been informed would be ready after. He looked at Marco. Marco had his arms crossed, and the expression he wore when he was paying full attention, without making a performance of it. "Ready," Beerus said. The initialization took 4 minutes and 11 seconds. For those 4 minutes and 11 seconds, Beerus sat completely still and channeled the passive output of his existence, the constant background radiation of a god of destruction simply being present in a universe that was not built for him. Through the dampening framework that Stark and Doom had built across 26 hours of productive mutual antagonism. The energy moved through the framework's architecture in the way that water moves through a well-designed channel, not suppressed but redirected, turned inward and back on itself. The signal that had been propagating outward through the universe's cosmic framework for 12 days folding down like a flag in still air. The sensor's banner was monitoring, showed the propagation index dropping in real time. From 31% above baseline to 28, to 22, to 15, to 9, to 4. To baseline. Signature nominal, Banner said quietly, and in the quiet of the store at midnight the words had a quality that was almost formal. Propagation suppressed, framework holding at 97% efficiency. He looked at Stark. It's working. Stark let out a breath. Of course it's working, I built it. Doom built 40% of it, Banner said. Doom contributed to the theoretical framework under my directional guidance, Stark said. And from the doorway Doom made a sound that managed to convey, without words, the complete architecture of his feelings about that characterization. Beerus opened his eyes. He sat for a moment in the new quiet of a reduced signal, his system reorienting to the channeled state, and assessed what it felt like to exist in this universe without broadcasting his presence at cosmic range. It felt, he decided, like turning down a light. The room was the same room. Everything in it was the same. Only the reach had changed. Done, he said. Marco uncrossed his arms and went to the back. Within 4 minutes, there was Ropa Vieja. Doom's breach closure calculations were completed at 31 hours, not 36. He presented this to the assembled group with the flat delivery of someone who considered meeting a deadline an expected baseline, and exceeding it by 5 hours, a minor administrative note rather than a meaningful achievement. Stark reviewed the calculations with the specific expression of someone looking for an error to point out and not finding one, which produced a silence that Banner found deeply entertaining and kept carefully off his face. The closure process requires 3 phases, Doom said, his display showing the dimensional architecture of the breach with a precision that Rogers found simultaneously reassuring and deeply uncomfortable, in the way that very clear maps of very bad terrain tended to be. Phase 1 is structural reinforcement of the breach edges. Phase 2 is dimensional pressure equalization between the 2 universal frameworks. Phase 3 is the actual closure, which must happen quickly to prevent backwash into either universe. Define quickly, Stark said. 90 seconds. From initiation to closure, the window is 90 seconds. After that, the pressure differential reverses and we lose the ability to close from this side. What happens if we lose the ability to close from this side? Rogers asked. The breach widens, Doom said. Progressively, the dimensional thinning that was introduced to create the initial conditions accelerates, and within approximately 72 hours, we have a full dimensional rupture. Not merely a passage between universes, a tear, with consequences for the fabric of both universes that I prefer not to detail at length, but which would register on the scale of significant cosmic events. So we don't miss the window, Rogers said. Correct. And we don't have intelligence on whatever arranged the breach from the other side, Fury said. Whatever entity set this up is still out there, potentially watching. Potentially waiting for the closure attempt, Doom said. A closure attempt creates a detectable event. If our unknown party is monitoring the breach, they will know we are acting. He paused. They may respond. The room sat with this. When do we move? Rogers said. Tomorrow night, Doom said. The breach cycle reaches its most accessible phase at 11 p.m. We have a 40-minute optimal window. Rogers looked at Fury. Fury nodded. Then we have one day, Rogers said. Let's use it. The day was, in Beerus's assessment, well used. Rogers spent it organizing, which was what Rogers did when something needed organizing, moving through the tactical preparations with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that the calm was genuine rather than performed. Stark spent it refining the breach closure support systems he was building into the Iron Man suit, and arguing productively with Doom about Phase 2 pressure equalization methodology. Banner spent it monitoring the dampener framework and running probability models with the quiet intensity of someone who found the work itself calming, which Beerus had identified early as one of Banner's more interesting qualities. Beerus spent part of it in conversation with Thor. They had found, over the preceding days, a register of communication that suited them both. Not warmth, exactly, though something adjacent to it had developed. More the specific mutual recognition of beings who occupied a particular category of existence, those for whom power was not an achievement but a condition, and for whom the question of what to do with that condition was genuinely open in ways it was not for beings whose power had limits they could feel. They sat on the roof of Varga's family groceries in the afternoon light, which had become, with the quiet inevitability of things that simply work, Beerus's preferred location for conversations that required space. In Asgard, Thor said, there is a word, Ragnarok, the end of all things, the destruction that cannot be stopped, only survived if one is fortunate. He looked at the city below them. I have spent much of my life fighting against the concept, refusing to accept that destruction is ever inevitable. And now, Beerus said, now I think I was asking the wrong question. Thor turned to look at him. You are a god of destruction. You have accepted your nature completely. You do not fight it. And yet here you sit, preparing to protect a planet you have known for less than 2 weeks. Destruction without purpose is entropy, Beerus said. I have said this. Purpose requires judgment. Judgment requires valuing some things over others. He looked at the city below. I have destroyed things that deserved destruction. I have preserved things that deserved preservation. The distinction between the two is the entire content of the job. Thor was quiet for a moment. Asgard could have used that philosophy in some of its earlier eras. Most places could, Beerus said. Most places learn it the hard way. Did you? The golden eyes moved to the horizon. The specific quality of late afternoon light over a city, turning the glass and steel warm and temporary looking. The way all built things look beautiful at the exact moment you notice they won't last forever. Yes, Beerus said, I learned it the hard way. Thor nodded. He did not ask for details and Beerus did not offer them, which was, in the specific language of beings who have long histories and selective memory, a form of respect. Galactus arrived at 9:47 p.m. 13 minutes before the optimal breach window. He did not arrive gradually. There was no atmospheric disturbance, no building cosmic pressure, no sequence of warning signs that built toward a climax. One moment the sky above Manhattan was the specific orange-gray of a light-polluted night, and the next moment it was not, because something had arrived in the upper atmosphere that was large enough and cosmically significant enough to simply displace the sky's previous agenda and replace it with its own. The alerts came simultaneously across every shield system, every Stark sensor array, every Asgardian detection protocol Thor had running. Fury's voice came through the comms with the compressed urgency of someone delivering bad news efficiently. "He's here, 13 minutes early. Upper atmosphere descending. We have estimates on size, but the estimates keep revising upward, so I'm going to stop quoting them." Rogers was already moving. "Everyone to positions. Doom, does the breach window change?" "The window is fixed by dimensional physics, not by Galactus's schedule," Doom said, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who found the universe's indifference to convenience professionally annoying. 11 p.m. We proceed. "That gives us 73 minutes with Galactus in the atmosphere before we can close the breach," Stark said. He was already in the suit, the Mark L assembling around him with the fluid efficiency of practiced emergency deployment. "I want to note for the record that 73 minutes with Galactus in the atmosphere is not a situation I would have selected." "Noted," Fury said. "Now go." What followed was not, by the standards of major cosmic confrontations, elegant. It was loud and chaotic, and proceeded with the specific energy of a situation where multiple parties with incompatible agendas were all operating simultaneously in the same space. The Avengers scrambled. Shield evacuation protocols activated across lower Manhattan. Thor went up to meet Galactus at altitude, which was not tactically sound, and was completely consistent with Thor's approach to problems of overwhelming scale, which was to put himself between the problem and everything else and work from there. Beerus went up too. Not immediately. He stood in the street outside Varga's family groceries for a moment and looked up at the thing descending through the clouds with the practiced assessment of someone who had encountered beings of this scale before and was calibrating. Galactus was large, cosmically, existentially large, the kind of large that the human visual system was not fully equipped to process, because the human visual system had evolved in an environment where nothing was that large. The power cosmic radiated from him in waves that Beerus could feel as pressure against his own energy framework, even at this distance. Impressive, he decided. Not overwhelming, impressive. He rose. The initial engagement between Thor and Galactus lasted approximately 4 minutes and achieved the tactical goal Thor had intended, which was not victory but attention. Galactus noticed Thor the way a person notices a persistent insect, with the mild irritation of something whose attention has been successfully captured despite its size differential. He raised one hand. Thor was deflected, not destroyed, and came to a stop approximately 2 miles to the east with the dazed look of someone who had hit something they understood intellectually, was very large, and had now confirmed it experientially. Stark hit Galactus from 3 angles simultaneously with energy output that represented the maximum capacity of the Mark L's power systems. The numbers were, objectively, enormous. By any terrestrial measure, by any conventional cosmic measure, the energy Stark delivered in that first exchange was significant. Galactus adjusted his course by approximately 2 degrees to look at him. "Right," Stark said into the comm, "so we're doing this the other way." The other way was Beerus. He came from above, which was a direction Galactus was not, at that particular moment, attending to, and he did not announce himself or perform an approach. He simply arrived at the scale of the engagement, which required him to draw on reserves that the dampener framework partially constrained, and he drew on them anyway because the situation required it, and constraints, in Beerus's philosophical framework, existed to be assessed and exceeded when assessment determined that exceeding them was correct. The first exchange between Beerus and Galactus stopped everything else. Not through destruction, through the sheer phenomenological weight of two beings operating at the upper registers of cosmic power making contact. The energy displacement created a shockwave at the upper atmosphere level that Stark's sensors registered and immediately stopped trying to quantify. Thor, recovering 2 miles east, looked toward the source of the shockwave and went still. Banner, in the mobile unit, watched his instruments cycle through 3 different measurement scales, trying to find one that could contain the data. Galactus stopped descending. He looked at Beerus with the full attention of something that had not, in a very long time, encountered something that warranted full attention. Beerus hovered in front of him, which required a certain adjustment of perception, because in front of was a relative term when one party to the confrontation was the size of a small moon, and said, with the precise calm of someone who had made this kind of assessment before and knew exactly what the data meant, "You were brought here deliberately. The signal you followed was arranged to attract you. The world below is not the prize you were led to believe." Galactus's voice, when it came, was not loud the way thunder is loud. It was present the way gravity is present, a fact of existence rather than a sound. The energy signature was real. "The energy signature was mine," Beerus said. "Unintentional. I was displaced here by external manipulation. The displacement has been addressed. The signal is already suppressed." He held the golden gaze of something so vast that eye contact was more metaphorical than literal. "The being who arranged my displacement wanted this world consumed. I am telling you that you are an instrument of someone else's purpose. You are the most powerful entity in this universe. I find it difficult to believe you are comfortable being used." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Stark, watching from 3 miles away at maximum altitude, said quietly into the closed comm channel to Rogers, "I genuinely cannot tell if he just made it worse." "Wait," Rogers said. They waited. "The world below," Galactus said finally, "produces complex energy patterns, significant events. It has been noted in my records before." "It is a loud world," Beerus agreed. "Interesting in the way that loud things sometimes are. Worth observing, not worth consuming. The energy yield would not justify the loss of whatever it becomes next." He paused. "I have been here for 13 days. In 13 days it has produced 2 significant technological developments, 1 cosmic-level diplomatic contact, and a dimensional breach closure that will be, when completed, a meaningful contribution to the stability of this universe's fabric." Another pause. "It also has exceptional food. The loss of the cuisine alone would be a net negative for cosmic culture." The silence this time was different. Not the silence of a being deciding between options. The silence of a being recalibrating. "You negotiate with aesthetics," Galactus said. "I negotiate with truth," Beerus said. "The aesthetics are incidental but accurate." The enormous presence above Manhattan shifted, not retreating, reassessing. The power cosmic moved in patterns that Beerus's senses read as the signature of genuine reconsideration rather than tactical repositioning. "The manipulation you describe," Galactus said, "the entity responsible. Unknown origin, pre-cosmic age, operating from outside this universe's framework." Beerus met the vast gaze steadily. "If you are interested in a genuine challenge rather than a manufactured meal, the entity that used you as an instrument is a more worthy target for your attention." Another silence. "I do not appreciate being used," Galactus said. And in the stripped simplicity of those 5 words was the weight of an ego so cosmically large that the offense was, by any measure, sincere. "I know," Beerus said. "Neither do I. That is why I am here." Somewhere below, at 11 p.m. exactly, the breach closure sequence initiated. Doom's 3-phase process began with structural reinforcement, the dimensional architecture responding to the pressure equalization framework with the careful precision of something that had been very well designed and was performing accordingly. Stark was feeding power into the process from the suit, Rogers coordinating the ground support, Banner monitoring the pressure indices with the focused intensity of someone for whom the next 90 seconds were the only seconds that currently existed. 60 seconds. The breach edges stabilized. Phase 2 engaged. 45 seconds. The pressure equalization moved through its sequence with the unhurried precision of mathematics working correctly. 30 seconds. Above the city, Galactus and Beerus remained motionless in the high atmosphere, 2 beings of incomprehensible power holding a stillness that was, in its own way, more significant than combat would have been. 15 seconds. Phase 3 initiated. 90 seconds from initiation, the breach that had been introduced gradually over months of careful manipulation, that had been designed by something ancient and patient and purposeful to bring a god of destruction to a universe that would eventually destroy him or be destroyed by him, closed. The dimensional fabric sealed. The signal was gone. The manufactured path home, such as it had been, was gone. Beerus felt it close. He sat with the fact of it for a moment, that the bridge back had been sealed, that he was now in this universe without a prepared exit, and found that the feeling this produced was less like loss and more like a door closing behind someone who had already decided which direction they were going. Below him, the city was intact. The people in it were alive. Marco's store was standing on the corner of 5th and 43rd with its lights on, and its shelves stocked, and its owner probably making coffee because that was what Marco did when things happened that required processing. Galactus turned his attention from the sealed breach back to Beerus. "The entity that arranged this," he said, "it will try again." "Yes," Beerus said, "probably. This universe will require monitoring." "Probably," Beerus said again. The vast presence shifted, beginning the process of departure with the unhurried authority of something that moved through the cosmos on its own schedule. "You are an unusual being," Galactus said, and the tone carried something that was, if not precisely respect, the cosmic equivalent of nodding a quality worth acknowledging. "Destruction that chooses. Destruction that judges," Beerus said. "The choice is downstream of the judgment." Galactus departed. The sky returned to orange-gray. Below, Manhattan began the process of resuming itself with the cheerful resilience of a city that had practiced resuming itself many times and had developed significant institutional capacity for it. Beerus descended. He landed on the sidewalk outside Varga's family groceries and stood there for a moment in the night air, the dampener framework holding his signal at baseline. The breach closed behind him. The immediate crisis resolved in the specific way that crises resolved when handled correctly, which was messily and incompletely and with several significant loose ends, but without the catastrophic outcomes that had been in play. The door of the store opened. Marco came out with 2 cups of coffee and the particular expression of a man who had watched the whole thing from the doorway and had decided that what was required now was coffee and not commentary. He held one out. Beerus took it. They stood on the sidewalk and drank coffee in the aftermath of a crisis that had almost consumed the world, and the city moved around them with the magnificent, indifferent continuity of a place that had been here before anything tonight and intended to be here long after. "You closed the way home," Marco said, not an accusation, just the fact offered plainly the way Marco offered everything. "The breach was a manufactured path," Beerus said, "not a real one. A real path home will take longer to find." He drank the coffee. It was good. It was always good. "I am not in a hurry." Marco nodded, drank his own coffee, looked at the street. "You can keep sleeping on the roof," he said. "The chair situation inside is getting complicated with all these people anyway." Beerus looked at him. "I will need better coffee in the mornings," Beerus said. "You'll get what I make," Marco said. "What you make is adequate," Beerus said. Which was, from Beerus, everything. The morning after Galactus came and left without consuming the world had a quality that Steve Rogers had learned, over years of mornings that followed significant nights, to recognize and appreciate. It was the specific quality of aftermath, the way light looked when it fell on things that had almost not been there to receive it, the way a city sounded when its continued existence was recent enough to still feel contingent rather than assumed. Manhattan had resumed itself with characteristic efficiency. The evacuation protocols had been stood down. The shield perimeter around the Midtown area had been quietly retracted in the early hours, the tactical vehicles withdrawing with the practiced invisibility of organizations that had learned how to appear and disappear without making the disappearance a story. By 7 a.m., the corner of 5th and 43rd looked, to anyone who had not been present the night before, like any other corner in the city on any other morning. Varga's Family Groceries was open. This was not surprising to anyone who knew Marco. Steve arrived at 8 with 2 cups of coffee he'd bought from the place 3 blocks north because he'd wanted the walk, and because arriving with coffee was something his mother had taught him about visiting people after difficult nights, and found Beerus on the stoop working through what appeared to be a methodical evaluation of every piece of fruit in a bowl Marco had set outside. This was apparently a daily ritual now. The assessment, Beerus running his fingers over each piece with the focused attention of a being who had decided that if he was going to be in this universe for an indefinite period, he was going to understand its produce thoroughly. Steve sat on the step beside him and held out a coffee. Beerus took it without looking up from a mango he was examining with professional concentration. "The breach is closed," Steve said. "Yes." Banner confirmed this morning that the signal is holding at baseline. "The dampener framework is stable." He paused. "You're not going anywhere soon." "No," Beerus agreed. He set down the mango and picked up the coffee. "The dimensional resonance between this universe and mine is complex. Without a prepared pathway, finding a natural traversal point could take considerable time. Months, possibly. Wise will eventually notice my absence and begin looking, but the search across dimensional boundaries is not a rapid process." "How will he find you?" "Wise finds everything eventually," Beerus said with the flat certainty of long experience. "He is irritatingly capable in that regard. When he does, the extraction will be straightforward." He drank the coffee. "Until then, I am here." Steve looked at the street. "How do you feel about that?" The golden eyes moved to him with the assessment that Steve had learned meant Beerus was deciding whether the question deserved a careful answer or a deflection. The question was genuine, and Steve's expression communicated that he understood the distinction, which apparently settled things. "In my universe," Beerus said slowly, "I sleep for extended periods, years, sometimes decades. I wake, I assess the state of balance, I address whatever requires addressing, and I return to sleep. The work is important. The intervals between the work are very long." He looked at the city. "I have been awake and present here for 14 days continuously. I have eaten more interesting food than in several of my most recent active periods combined. I have had conversations that I found genuinely worth having." A pause. "I am not distressed by the delay." Steve nodded. "That is not an admission of weakness," Beerus added, with the precision of someone identifying a potential misreading. "I didn't think it was," Steve said. Beerus drank his coffee and said nothing further, which meant, Steve had learned, that he was satisfied with how the conversation had gone. The formal debrief happened at 10 a.m. in the S.H.I.E.L.D. safe house, which had by this point become so familiar to the assembled group that people had developed assigned seat habits and coffee preferences that the logistics staff had quietly begun accommodating. Fury ran it with his characteristic efficiency, moving through the operational assessment with the focused brevity of someone who had already processed the emotional dimensions of the previous night privately, and was now in the business of institutional response. The good news was clear and significant. The breach was closed. The signal was suppressed. Galactus had departed without consuming anything. The world was intact. The bad news was equally clear. The entity that arranged this is still unknown and still active, Fury said. We know it's old. We know it's operating from outside this universe's conventional framework. We know it wanted either Beerus destroyed or this planet consumed, possibly both. He looked at the table. We don't know if it will try again. It will try again, Doom said, from his position near the window where he had settled with the particular quality of someone who had attended this debrief as a courtesy rather than a necessity and was managing the time efficiently. Whatever its objective, the closure of the breach represented a setback, not a defeat. Entities that operate on this timescale and with this level of preparation do not abandon objectives. They revise strategies. Agreed, Beerus said. He was at the end of the table with a cup of what Marco had sent in a thermal flask, and the particular attention he brought to meetings he found substantively useful. In my universe, beings that operate at this level of patience are not deterred by single failures. They are deterred by the consistent demonstration that their methodology will not succeed. So we need to make it consistently clear that this kind of approach doesn't work here, Rogers said. We need to understand what it wants, Banner said. We've been treating this as a threat to neutralize, but the strategy was sophisticated. It required months of preparation, cross-dimensional manipulation, and the willingness to expend significant resources on a single operation. Whatever the objective is, it's important enough to justify that investment. He adjusted his glasses. Understanding the objective is the most useful thing we can do right now. That requires intelligence on the entity itself, Stark said, which we currently don't have. Doom's dimensional analysis identified age markers in the manipulation technique, Banner said. If we refine those markers further, cross-reference with Asgardian records of pre-cosmic entities, and combine that with whatever Beerus can tell us about beings from his universe's earliest periods, we might get somewhere, Fury said. He looked at Beerus. That's going to require your cooperation. You have it, Beerus said, without hesitation and without performance. Just the flat statement of someone who had decided something and saw no reason to elaborate on the decision. The room's atmosphere shifted slightly. the particular shift of a group that had been working together under pressure and had reached the point where the working relationship had graduated into something more settled. Fury nodded once. Then we have a path forward. He closed the briefing folder. Now let's talk about the other matter. The other matter was Beerus's status. This had been in the background of every operational meeting since day one, the quietly ticking administrative question that no one had prioritized, while more immediate concerns were consuming the agenda. With the immediate concerns resolved, it had moved to the front. The positions around the table were, as Fury had anticipated, varied. The formal Asgardian position, delivered through Thor with the careful diplomatic language of someone conveying a message they had been asked to convey accurately and had opinions about, was that Beerus should be recognized as a sovereign divine entity with the same treaty protections extended to Asgard under the current interdimensional accords. The practical implication was that Beerus's presence on Earth would have official Asgardian acknowledgement, which meant that any action against him would carry diplomatic consequences at the divine level. Odin is hedging, Stark said when Thor finished. Odin is being practical, Thor said, with the honesty of a son who had spent centuries being on the receiving end of that practicality. He does not know this being. He cannot assess him fully, but he knows what happened last night, and he knows what did not happen, which is the destruction of this planet, and he is extending recognition on that basis. He paused. Also, he received my report on the food argument with Marco, and he found it reassuring. The coconut milk thing reassured the Allfather, Stark said. A being who cares about the correct preparation of food, Thor said, with the simple logic of someone raised in a culture that took hospitality seriously, is a being who cares about the things that are worth caring about. The governmental position, delivered through Fury with the careful language of multiple conversations with people whose names did not appear in meeting notes, was that Beerus would be classified as a visiting diplomatic entity with temporary resident status, which was a category that S.H.I.E.L.D. had created 3 years ago to manage Thor's periodic Earth visits, and which had the advantage of providing legal framework without implying permanence. Visiting diplomatic entity, Beerus said, with the expression of someone testing the weight of a phrase. From where? We're listing it as Universe 7B, Fury said. We had to call it something. Universe 7B, Beerus repeated. He considered this. That is a poor name. You're welcome to submit an alternative. I will consider it. The Avengers position was delivered by Rogers, which was appropriate because Rogers had been, throughout the 14 days, the person whose relationship with Beerus had been most consistently honest on both sides, and honesty was the only register in which the conversation that needed to happen could happen. We'd like you to have a formal connection to the Avengers, Rogers said. Not membership necessarily. A consultancy relationship, maybe. A standing agreement that if something comes up at the cosmic scale, we can reach you, and if something comes up that concerns you, you can reach us. In exchange for what? Beerus said, which was not suspicious, just precise. In exchange for the same thing, Rogers said. Mutual access, mutual consultation, the ability to share information about threats that operate at scales neither of us can fully address alone. Beerus looked at Rogers for a long moment. You are not asking me to be a weapon, Beerus said. No, Rogers said. I'm asking you to be a colleague. The words settled in the room with the specific weight of words that mean exactly what they say, and nothing more and nothing less. I will consider this also, Beerus said, but the way he said it was different from the way he had said he would consider the universe name. There was something in it that was already closer to yes than to consideration. The paperwork, as Banner noted in the debrief summary he filed that afternoon, was extraordinary. The formal recognition documents ran to 40 pages. The diplomatic protocols required 3 separate legal frameworks, 2 of which had to be partially invented for the occasion. The security clearance designation for Beerus, which Fury handled personally with the handwriting of a man who had long since made peace with writing strange things in official documents, read in full: Beerus Entity Classification, Divine Sovereign Universe of Origin, 7B DISPUTED, Threat Assessment, Significant Alliance Status, Cooperative Special Notes, see attached Food PRFERNCES, Extensive see separate file. The separate file on food preferences was 12 pages long and had been compiled primarily by Marco, who had taken the task seriously enough that it included a section on regional variation and a concluding paragraph about the importance of fresh versus canned ingredients that Banner suspected was less official documentation and more the continuation of an ongoing argument. Stark had the whole thing framed. He presented it to Beerus with the mock solemnity of a ceremony and the genuine satisfaction of someone who had found the exact right way to acknowledge a moment. Beerus had looked at it for a long time, reading every page with the careful attention he brought to things he considered worth examining properly. He had looked at the food preferences file longest. "The coconut milk section is inaccurate," he said. "I know," Stark said. "Marco wrote it." "Marco is wrong about this." "I know. I will correct it." "I hoped you would," Stark said. And in the simple, clean delivery of that sentence was something that was not quite warmth and not quite humor, but occupied the territory between them where people who have been through something difficult together sometimes find themselves unexpectedly. The conversation between Beerus and Marco that evening was not, in the formal sense, significant. It did not produce documents or policy. It did not advance any tactical position or resolve any remaining operational question. It happened on the stoop, in the last light of a day that had started with aftermath and moved through bureaucracy and arrived, as days in New York tend to do, at the particular quality of early evening that made everything look briefly and genuinely beautiful. Marco had closed the store at 6. He had produced from somewhere a bottle of something that he described as his father's recipe, and that Beerus, who had consumed substances across several universes, assessed as genuinely excellent. They had been sitting in companionable quiet for several minutes when Marco said, with the directness that Beerus had identified early as one of his most consistent and valuable qualities, "You're staying." "For now," Beerus said. "For now," Marco agreed, "and then Wise finds you and you go back." "Eventually." Marco poured 2 small glasses from the bottle, handed one to Beerus. "You know what I'm going to do when you go back." Beerus looked at him. "Keep the store open," Marco said. "Same hours, same produce, same everything." He looked at the street. "Because that's what you do. You keep the thing open, whatever else happens." Beerus looked at his glass. The amber liquid caught the streetlight and held it. "In my universe," he said, "I have been the instrument of endings. I have closed things that were open. I have reduced to nothing things that people kept going despite everything." He paused. "I have never before this considered what it meant to be present for the keeping open." Marco was quiet. "It is," Beerus said, "an interesting perspective." Marco raised his glass. Beerus raised his. They drank, on the stoop of Varga's family groceries, as the city settled into its evening self around them, as the streetlights came on in sequence down the avenue, and the traffic changed its character from daytime urgency to nighttime rhythm, and the specific sound of Manhattan at dusk rose and fell and rose again with the magnificent, indifferent persistence of a place that had been doing this every evening for centuries and intended to continue indefinitely. 3 blocks away, in a monitoring station that S.H.I.E.L.D. had quietly established in a building whose owner had accepted the rental terms without asking questions he clearly understood he shouldn't ask. A technician named Reyes, the same Reyes who had been on the Prometheus's observation deck when the purple sphere had descended through the Atlantic sky, watched the passive sensor feed and made a note in the daily log. The note read, "Signature stable, no anomalous readings, subject present at known location, all clear." She paused, added, "Also they appear to be having a drink, seemed worth nodding." She filed the report and reached for her own coffee and thought about how 14 days ago she had been on an observation deck, watching something fall from the sky, and had not known what it was or what it would mean, and how now she knew neither completely but knew considerably more than she had, and how the gap between those two states of knowledge was, in her experience, where most of the interesting things in life tended to happen. 2 weeks later, the first indication of the unknown entity's revised strategy arrived in the form of a dimensional anomaly detected by Doom's monitoring system in low Earth orbit. It was small, careful, the kind of thing designed to be missed by anyone not specifically looking for it. Doom was specifically looking for it. He sent a message to Fury. Fury sent a message to Rogers. Rogers called Stark. Stark sent a message to Banner. Banner, who had been running continuous monitoring of the dimensional framework since the breach closure, confirmed the reading and expanded the analysis. The anomaly was not a breach. It was a probe, something testing the fabric of the universe's dimensional boundary at a point away from the original breach location, exploring, assessing, looking for another thin place that could be worked over months into another funnel. The data was sent to Beerus. He read it on the roof of Varga's family groceries at midnight, sitting in the same place he had been sitting when the AIM operatives had come with their incapacitation devices, and discovered that the decision to use them was inadvisable. The city was quiet below. The dampener framework held his signal at baseline. The stars above Manhattan were, as always, mostly invisible behind the light pollution, though he could see them anyway, had always been able to see through whatever obscured them, the deep field of the universe laid out in its vastness and its age. He sat with the data for a long time. Then he sent a message back. It contained 4 words. "I see it too." It was not a reassurance. It was not a declaration or a promise or a statement of intent. It was simply the truth, plainly delivered. The acknowledgement that he was present, that he was paying attention, that whatever came next would be met by someone who had been watching for exactly this. Somewhere in the space between universes, something patient and ancient continued its work. On a rooftop in Manhattan, a god of destruction sat in the dark and watched the stars and waited with the infinite patience of a being who had learned, over millions of years of existence, that the most important quality in any confrontation was not power or strategy or preparation, though all of those mattered. It was the willingness to stay. He was willing to stay.
14 days. That was how long it had taken for a god of destruction to fall into the wrong universe, eat his way through a corner store's produce inventory, negotiate with the Silver Surfer over the philosophical dimensions of cosmic hunger, face down Galactus with an argument about cuisine, and decide, without ceremony or announcement, that he was not in a particular hurry to leave. By any reasonable measure, 14 days was nothing. A footnote in the life of a being who slept for decades between relevant events. A blink in the history of a universe that had been accumulating significant moments since before most of its current inhabitants had names for time. And yet, the Marvel Universe had been changed by arrivals before. Thor had arrived, initially in the form of a confused exile stripped of his power in a New Mexico desert, and had become something the universe organized itself around. Steve Rogers had been retrieved from the ice, and the world had rearranged its understanding of what heroism meant in the modern age. The Infinity War had changed everything, and then everything had changed back, which was itself a kind of change that left permanent marks even on the things that appeared restored. Beerus's arrival was different from all of these. He had not come to be a hero. He had no origin story of loss redeemed or power earned or sacrifice made meaningful. He was not a symbol. He was not an inspiration. He was a god of destruction from a universe with different rules, stranded by someone else's plan, who had looked at what was around him and made a series of small, consistent decisions that accumulated over 14 days into something that resembled commitment. He had not made grand speeches. He had not pledged himself to the protection of Earth with the formal language of beings who understood that formal language was how you made things permanent. He had argued about coconut milk with a corner store owner. He had answered questions honestly and asked them carefully. He had removed a weapons array that pointed at him, negotiated with a cosmic herald over the value of a planet's food culture, and sat on a stoop drinking coffee in the aftermath of a near-extinction event, with the equanimity of someone who had decided that equanimity was the correct response. These were not the actions of someone passing through. The universe, for its part, had responded to him the way it responded to everything significant, which was by rearranging itself around the fact of his presence. The intelligence community now had a file on the category of divine sovereign cosmic entities that had not previously required its own category. The Asgardian diplomatic archives had a new entry. Stark's theoretical physics database had been substantially revised, and would continue to be revised as Banner worked through the implications of the energy data collected over 14 days. The dimensional monitoring network that Doom had quietly expanded in the aftermath of the breach had already detected the unknown entity's probe, which meant the next attempt, whenever it came, would be met with preparation rather than surprise. Small changes, permanent ones. The kind that compound. Marco Vargas had not asked to be significant. He had a store to run and produce to source and suppliers to argue with, and a neighborhood that depended on the store being there and being good. He had a family recipe for flan and strong opinions about fresh versus canned coconut milk, and 31 years of accumulated wisdom about what people needed when they came through his door, which was usually something to eat, and occasionally just the fact of a place that was reliably open. He had given a god of destruction a bag for his mangoes. Everything else had followed from there, with the simple causality of things that are set in motion by uncomplicated acts of decency. What Marco understood, and what Beerus had recognized in him from the first moment with the specific recognition of a being who had seen enough of the universe to know what was rare and what was common, was that the things worth preserving were not the grand things. They were not the towers or the governments or the formal structures that announced their own importance. They were the corners, the open stores, the people who produced a second flan from their jacket pocket without being asked, because they had correctly assessed that the situation required it. Destruction, Beerus had said once, was not the opposite of preservation. They were partners. What he had not said, but what his 14 days in this universe had demonstrated with the completeness of a proof, was that the judgment required to know which was called for was not a cosmic function. It was not something that operated at the scale of universes and power levels and dimensional frameworks. It operated at the scale of a card table on a sidewalk, at the scale of a conversation about ripeness indicators in tropical produce, at the scale of coffee brought to someone at the end of a long night without being asked. The threat that had arranged Beerus's arrival was real. It was patient, and it was ancient, and it had demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to operate across dimensional boundaries with a sophistication that meant dismissing it was not an available option. It would try again. The probe Doom had detected was the first indication of a revised strategy, and revised strategies from entities of this age and patience were not things that resolved quickly or cleanly. The war, if it could be called that, was just beginning. But wars of this kind, Beerus knew from the long archive of his experience, were not won at the moment of the first significant confrontation. They were won in the accumulation of preparation, of alliance, of the slow, patient work of people who had decided that what they were defending was worth the sustained effort of defending it. The Avengers had been doing this work for years, each crisis adding to the institutional knowledge of how to survive the unsurvivable and how to build, from the aftermath, something more durable than what had existed before. He was part of that now. Not because he had pledged himself to it, not because of a document or a ceremony or a formal declaration, because he had been on a stoop for 14 days and had drunk coffee with a man who kept his store open regardless of what happened outside it. And that was, in the end, the oldest and most reliable mechanism by which beings of any power level in any universe became part of something larger than themselves. You stayed. You kept showing up. Everything else followed. 3 weeks after his arrival, Beerus stood on the roof of Varga's family groceries at dawn and felt the first faint resonance of a familiar energy at the extreme edge of his perception. Not close, not urgent, but present. The way the first light of a dawn is present before the sun actually clears the horizon, a warmth that arrived ahead of its source. Wise was looking. He would find the dimensional thread eventually, trace it back to this universe, navigate the cross-dimensional distance with the infuriating competence that had always been his defining characteristic, and arrive with the specific expression of someone who had traveled an inconvenient distance to collect someone who should not have required collecting, and would have opinions about the situation that he would deliver in the polished, pleasant tone that made them somehow more pointed than bluntness would have. Beerus was not in a hurry for that conversation. He looked at the city below him, waking into its morning self with the unhurried certainty of a place that had been doing this every day for centuries. The light was good. The air had the quality it sometimes got in early morning, before the day fully committed to itself, clean and provisional and briefly, genuinely quiet. From below, the smell of coffee. Marco opened early. Beerus descended from the roof with the unhurried ease of someone who had somewhere to be, and was not particularly concerned about getting there quickly, landed on the sidewalk, and pushed open the door of Varga's family groceries. Marco, behind the counter, did not look up from the produce he was sorting. "Coffee's ready," he said. Beerus sat down on the stool at the end of the counter that had, over 3 weeks, become his stool in the particular way that things become yours not through ownership, but through consistent presence, and accepted the cup that Marco set in front of him without ceremony or commentary. He drank it. It was good. It was always good. Whatever came next, it would be met from here. From this corner, this stool, this cup. From the accumulated weight of small decisions made correctly and relationships built honestly, and the willingness, finally, after millions of years of arriving and departing and arriving again, to simply be somewhere and mean it. Beerus, god of destruction, resident of Universe 7B as per SHIELD documentation, drank his coffee in the early morning quiet of a corner store in Manhattan, and watched the city come alive through the front window with the patient attention of someone who intended to be watching for a long time. The universe, as always, continued. It did so with a god of destruction in it who had chosen, against all reasonable expectation, and with the simple finality of a decision that required no announcement, to pay attention. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. With great power comes great responsibility. More stories await.